those of you may know that's a Giant's Causeway on the north side of Ireland, not too far from Scotland. How about that Finn McCool? And of course, it's controversial about how long it formed and all that stuff. There's hourglass in the top of the design, and then like an ammonite sliced open. This isn't one of my best samples, but it's one I found not that long ago in West Texas. Just kind of cross-section would be the right word. And then, of course, the Earth, and then tree rings. So you think, how can tree rings relate to the edge of the Earth? And we're going to try to connect these issues together. The book has over 450 footnotes and over 130 charts, illustrations, and graphs. And that's what we're going to dig into here. And if you've written a book, I'm totally okay with the idea. I'll review your book, and you could review my book. But on Amazon, I don't have a whole lot of reviews yet. So if you could give me a positive review, or at least a non-negative review, I would be most grateful. All right, here's the website, and again, you can grab my card off the table there. Has my info. And what kind of lizard-type creature is that on the right? I know some of y'all are biology experts. The one that changes color? Yeah, chameleon, very good. And I guess I didn't do too good in spelling in school because I CH, see this, boy, anyway. But it's a chameleon. Yes, exactly. And so how old is your favorite planet? And it'll take you to the Amazon, in case you want to buy the book for your friends and family. Please subscribe to my YouTube. And again, you can leave some nice comments. And then, and I'm looking for animators, if you know some animators. And right now, I just have kind of an informational video there. But I have one of my former students who's going to help me, like, go out in the field and take some pictures of rocks and videos and stuff to make it actual content. You know, that's the ideal thing for a video to be. So we're working on that. And then, like I said, some animation, something that'd be fun. And then this will take us to our Young Earth Science blog. I'm going to talk about a different blog in a second, but that'll take us to that. And then if you could support our Zazzle store. And if you go further down, it'll take you to the Facebook and all that kind of stuff. I actually have something on Wikipedia. And as we all know, if it's on Wikipedia, it has to be true. Now, of course, being Wikipedia, what they did is they stuffed it into the history. So on my Facebook, I have a direct link that'll go right to that history in case you want to read. So it's real straight, dealing with standard sources, and something that someone that's a little more skeptical that might not be ready for a Bible study, that's what this is. So let's deal with the scientific topics. Okay, there's not, abolish your old earth arguments. I've taken care of the evolution issue. Now are you willing to accept maybe God has really spoken to man, and what the scripture says about Jesus Christ is really true. So if you'd consider it in that sense. And I know there's kind of different approaches. Basically, it's an evidence kind of characteristic. But I do talk about in the book about presuppositions and assumptions and worldview. And again, it's in the subtitle of the book. So it's sort of like a both-and approach to these sorts of things. Now, some of you may be familiar with Bruce Malone. Bruce Malone? All right, very good. Oh, yeah. Well, I pulled some of this data from him about the chameleon. So why chameleon? A chameleon can look in opposite directions at the same time. Pretty good trick. Do we have any teachers in the house? Okay. And I try to make it fun and have some participation, so I appreciate your cooperation there. But a teacher can do the same thing because they have eyes in the back of their head. But we should look in two opposite directions. One, see all these arguments and know about what they are, say for radiometric dating, and that the geology took a long time to form, and how in the world could this stalactite, form fast and all this stuff. And at the same time, we need to know the positive evidence that the Earth is actually young, say too much helium in the atmosphere, all these things, as well as the biblical arguments. And as for the biblical arguments, there's a whole lot of books I could possibly recommend, but just to pick one, Coming to Grips with Genesis, edited by Terry Mortensen and Thane Urey. And many of those authors are here in California, interestingly enough. And of course, Terry Mortensen is most known for writing about the scriptural geologists who lived in the early 1800s, who defended the flood both from geology and from scripture. And it's often been said, well, they invented, flood geology just, in the 1930s or whatever. It's just completely false. Mortensen has definitely put a nail in that thing. Now, A chameleon can stick out its tongue 1.5 times its body length. Anybody happen to have that skill? You know, we all have interesting human skills. Like I've known some people that can put their fist all the way into their mouth. You know, it's interesting. I don't know how that works, but sometimes people have that. But what's really unique for a chameleon is it can give a punch that's 50 Gs, and that's pretty good. No other vertebrate can make that claim. 50 Gs, that's pretty good. Now, a test pilot, that was someone who's an expert, that's all the Gs they can handle, just 10. You know, they're out. And we went to the science, me with my mom and some of our relatives, we went to the Science Museum in Oklahoma City, and they have one of those spinning things like you might see on the playground. And I thought, this will be easy, I can handle this, showing my son, this is the way you do it, because he did it, didn't get much out of it. You know, like the ice skater, they go like this, and they spin them out 10 times faster. Don't do that, don't do that. Don't show off for your kids. So anyway, I got almost nearly really sick, and finally he was able to get me off of the thing, because I was almost like blender speed. So anyway, they need to have a sign next to that thing, people over 50, stay away from this thing. It was pretty dangerous. But the idea is 10 Gs and that's it. So chameleon must be pretty smart to be able to do that. And when they stick their tongue out, what are they trying to eat? There you go. So to catch the bugs, their tongue needs to turn into a suction cup. Imagine 2 chameleons trying to fight for the same bug. They're playing badminton or tennis, because if they didn't have a suction cup, now we're back to the irreducible complexity. This couldn't have all fit together in a step-by-step process. It all had to come together, which shows that God created it. All right, I think I hit all those points. All right, let's move on. So the next one is the blog that I'm actually most known for. If you just Google Adam's Lost Stream, this is what'll pop up. And Michio Kaku, is anyone familiar with that guy? Okay, he's a co-founder of string theory. And who's heard of the show Science Fantastic? Has anyone actually heard that on the radio? Yeah, it's actually in our market, believe it or not, which is kind of interesting. Now he's total materialist. Total materialist, doesn't believe in the soul or anything. And of course out at where I'm from, not too far from Midland, Odessa, we got the big oil people. So apparently there's a guy with the real big oil money, and he says, you know who we need to bring out here? Michio Kaku. So we actually got to hear him last year, the physics professor where I teach Howard College in Big Spring, Texas, and some other people came. And it was kind of interesting, because we thought we might kind of like we were doing, autograph a book, might get to meet him, but it's like right after the talk, he vanished. So, when you get these big time celebrities, they got to have their, I guess they go into a limousine and drive off into the sunset or something. But anyway, in high school, made a particle accelerator. Hey, hey, that's pretty good. Particle accelerator. And of course, the whole neighborhood, the lights dim. It was quite a deal. Actually, it was Edward Teller, or his family, helped him to get into Harvard. So it's quite an interesting story. And sadly, his family was in one of the internment camps. So interesting background. So I'm thinking it was that, because his family was in, and how could God let this happen? And maybe that was the little, because often these people, there's something happens. Maybe their parents died at an early age, there's something, and it trips. And then internally, there's this inward anger against God. Again, I'm maybe over psychologizing, but a possibility. But don't ask me to explain all those drawings. That's string field theory. It's not my area. And again, that is not a recent picture, those of you that do have followed him. And then I think the book I have on him is the multi-dimensions. That's part of his thinking. But why did I mention that? Oh, this is one of my most popular blogs off that site of May of 2011. Epic fail, because he doesn't realize that science itself is based on what? The Bible, Christianity. God made an orderly world. God put good thoughts in our heads so we can figure out how to understand, say, the law of gravity or Maxwell's equations, etc., etc. And of course, one of my favorites is the Weber-Fechner law, or Weber, if you're familiar with that pronunciation. But if you give me 2 rocks and ask me to say, okay, which one's heavier? I got this ammonite fossil, and I think this might be some limestone with tiny little shell creatures. I think it might be this one, but they're so close it's hard to tell. But that's the Weber-Fechner law. It has the math number E in it, and all of your senses, it fits that law. Whether it's which is the louder sound, which is the more rougher material. All of your senses fit that law, and it's pretty neat. But that's because God made an orderly universe. That's the easiest explanation. All right, so good old Miss Yukaka there. Big old applause up here. All right, now for some scripture. Again, I do believe what the scripture says, and I do believe that it points us to Christ. That's the ultimate thing to this. But I think sometimes God can use evidence in that process, evidence for scripture, and evidence refuting what our non-Christian friends are depending on, namely, in most cases, evolution. So notice it kind of fades in. I did that kind of font that way on purpose. And this is what Peter said about the scoffers. For they deliberately overlook this fact, that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. And of course, you might be more familiar with the willingly ignorant translation. So they deliberately overlook it. So for me, because it's kind of dark, I kind of want to go to 4, they, this, back. And but the thing is, there's lots of evidence out there. You deliberately overlook it. So actually, there's actually explanation for that. This is some kind of a shellfish of some kind. Maybe it's a brachipod. But Tertullian found things like this up on the mountains. So wow, this must connect with Noah's flood. This is evidence of the deluge. Shellfish is way back, the ocean's way back there. I'm pretty high and I'm seeing a fossilized shellfish. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to put some of these ideas together. They deliberately overlook what's out there. And then what's the little picture at the bottom? Yeah, that's the Ark, right? And somewhere near Cincinnati is where they're going to be having that eventually, and hopefully they can get all their lawsuits and whatnot figured out. So there's tons and tons of flood traditions, and a lot of the secular scholars that study that, they do get that. It seems to be pointing to something. Sometimes they say, well, maybe it was a localized flood. That's often the common way to get around it. Oh, I forgot to ask my icebreaker question. Who in here has ever met in person the very first Henry Morris? Okay, I see some hands up. So there's 4 of us. 4 of us. So the Genesis, 5 of us. The Genesis flood fame. Very good. So that was my icebreaker. We all feel ice broken now? We're all good? Okay, right. Yes, okay, good. So about the world that perished, and that was again one of Whitcomb's books. He titled one of his books by that. And this is Noah's Ark. So back to the scholars. There's one real famous book that compiled these, and is called Folklore in the Old Testament. That was James Fraser. And since it's an older book, you can get it the unabridged online, Google Books. And a whole, flood tradition after, I don't know if there's hundreds or whatever, but quite a few in terms of one place, and being an older work that's easy to get to. So once he's compiled all these, he says, well, what could they possibly mean? So he says, scholars in the past took that this really related to a historical event, that a catastrophe that covered whole, but obviously we know today, well, that obviously can't be right. And then he goes paragraph after paragraph trying to debunk this. That is, he's willingly ignorant. He's deliberately overlooking what it's really saying. So he knows that all these flood traditions from throughout the world, that they're definitely different. A common source, because Noah told his kids, their kids told their kids, and especially after the Tower of Babel, these traditions kind of got distorted. So the obvious conclusion is there, but he doesn't want to admit to it. So there's another example of being willingly ignorant like that. And on the book there, Sacred Cows and Science, is edited by Norbert Smith, and he has a Texas Tech grad in zoology. He was on a BBC documentary about reptiles, and that's his background. And so it covers all the worldview topics. It talks about climate change, overdoing environmentalism, animal rights. Talks about dinosaur and man coexistence. My chapter defends the flood. That's what my chapter in there is. And if you're familiar with Dennis Jernigan, the famous musician, he does the last chapter, which relates to a gay marriage because he was delivered from that background. Okay, now again, I like to try to keep this interactive and fun and whatnot. Hopefully we're having some fun. And I know y'all have had physics, but if you can play along with me, humor me a little bit. Okay, is light a particle? Raise your hand. If you think light's a particle. Okay. If you think light is a wave, raise your hand. Okay, guess what? You're both right. At least that's the usual interpretation. So now I'm going to take an analogy. Which group believes in the young earth? How many people think creationists believe in the young earth? Okay. How many people think non-creationists believe in the young earth? Okay, again, you know, I'm trying to lead up to something here. So, here we are, yes, supporters and sympathizers. Lucretius, Roman poet, and Epicurean, he died in 45 BC. He explicitly supported a young earth. And basically, his argument is this. I'm sure you all saw Brad Pitt and Troy. So that happened a long time ago. Okay? So, if the world actually went back thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago before that, and if you accept, which a lot of evidence seems to hold, that related to the Neanderthals, how come we don't have stories of, oh yeah, there was this Neanderthal group and they punched out a bunch of mastodons and boy, you should have seen it. How come we don't have stories that made the Troy story? That's hardly anything. So that was, and also the increase of technology. Like we have, you know, our Google glasses today. We're going to have the Retina, you know, computer in a few months. You know, what if you trace that back? Then technology can't be that old because we're coming up with these new gizmos all the time. That was the second argument. Now, those of you who have a philosophical background, is David Hume normally thought of as being a good friend of Christianity? No. Not at all. Not at all. So the point there is that he did hold to a young earth, and his argument was this. Haven't there been explorers before Columbus? I mean, we've known how to make boats, and, you know, we've learned our navigation and stuff. So basically, the travel of the world before Columbus, and if you studied books like, say, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, there is a lot of evidence that others have, and the Chinese and so forth, have discovered before that. So the world can't be old. And then how plants get distributed to different places. So we talked about how the grapes or the grapevines got into France, and we extrapolate that. It didn't take that long for different plants and animals to distribute around the world. And he explicitly defended the young earth. Richard Milton. He's often been accused of being a creationist. Excuse me. He wrote the book Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, and there's a chapter in that really defends the young earth very clearly. He's often been tagged as an agnostic, and he's a science journalist, so he definitely would be a more firm position on that. And he was in this NBC documentary, The Mysterious Origins of Man. It was on NBC in the late 90s a couple times that at least presented some alternative views on some things. Vine Deloria, is anyone familiar with him? Okay, he's a Native American scholar, and he wrote a book that kind of shot down paradigms from all directions, but at least he showed that a lot of the geological arguments are really circular, as I'm sure y'all are aware. Is anybody familiar with James Hogan? Okay, he's an award-winning sci-fi author. His background was is an aeronautical engineer, and his book, a different title but similar, Kicking the Sacred Cows. He criticizes a lot of the current theories, and again, I'd throw him under the sympathizer context. Now, William Corliss, he wrote a whole series of books of scientific anomalies, so showing, say, the dating methods, they don't jive, or some that do point explicitly to a young earth. And then, interestingly enough, going back to science fiction, Arthur C. Clarke said some really nice things about William Corliss. We look at the Earth; it looks young. Go to the Grand Canyon. Obviously, it looks young from our perspective because we're saying this is catastrophic. And look, one layer was formed to the other. We don't see the erosional features that would indicate a time gap. But just to kind of prove that thing, I have a wishbone here from a chicken. And who says that it's over 5 years old? Wishbone there. Anybody say it's over 5 years old? Anybody says that it's over 10 years old? Okay, there you go. That's the point. So when they say, well, the Earth looks old, well, what are they basing it on? It's about a year old, in case you were curious. But we could have a carbon dating later. So, but the point is if I brainwash you and say it's at least 5 years old, you know, I've already put a thought in your head. Okay, who's been to this place? Petrified Forest.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
One of my favorite places in Old
Yes. Now, one thing I haven't been able to nail down is is exactly how many rings there are. I don't know if there might be hundreds of rings or whatnot. I'm not sure. So that's the question I'm trying to get. Does anybody happen to know? Like, say, some of the trees in the petrified forest, how many rings?
That much of the time you don't have that particular detail preserved in the log. So what you see there, kind of a little bit in that picture is acatizing, where you have some very rough structure preserved. Maybe you can get some sense of what the center grain was, but much of the time the details of the fibers and the details of the rings gets obscured,
Right.
Particularly from that particular area. About the time you see internal detail being preserved is if it is a fossilized palm tree. And then you will see the individual fibers that run inside the tree. But most of the time, the rings are going to be hard to count because the fossilization process there obscured the detail of the fibers.
Right, I get it. That makes a lot of sense. So, one thing related to tree rings, I'm sure you all are aware of how the solar cycle, it has an effect on the radioactive decay. In some studies, I reference it in my book, on the solar cycles, we have kind of a two-part of the 22-year cycle. It's like 11 and 11. Well, that 11 part, by a study of tree rings, one researcher found that it actually one time was as short as 7. So maybe, again, a possibility that the increased solar activity could have caused increased radioactive decay in the past. And there's several levels of radioactivity depending on exactly what the action is. It can have more intense effects on the increased radioactivity. And believe it or not, John Jolly, one of the early researchers, he actually, even though he was one of the first ones to apply radioactivity as a dating method, actually rejected it and did propose explicitly that maybe the decay rate was faster in the past. And you know, where have we heard that before? That's pretty good. And of course, these particular allegedly 200, you can look at them, right? Look closely. They're about 200 million years old, right? That's supposedly how old they are. All right, let's take something a little bit different. This is a living Araucaria, how do you say that? A modern one. And then there's a fossil one from Madagascar, again, supposedly 200 million years old. Now, the oldest fossil trees by mainstream dating go back to 385 million years. So think about this. For 385 million years, we've had these trees that have a whole bunch of tree rings. Now, we can go to different places around the world, and some trees have thousands of rings. Let's do the math. So, if some trees today have thousands of rings, how come none of the fossil trees, even considering, a lot of times they're obliterated, that we don't find trees that aren't just hundreds of, have hundreds of rings, but thousands of rings? It doesn't quite click, unless maybe all this happened during the Great Flood, which only was, 1,600 years plus after creation rate. Then it all makes sense. So that's kind of the crux of my argument there. Now, does anybody happen to know the fossil tree with the most rings? And of course, if you've read my book, you know what I say in there.
You're talking about a fossil tree or a living tree?
A fossil tree, a petrified tree, and what I mean by that, it would be a one that was buried during the flood.
And by fossilized, you mean fully permineralized?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So what tree would that be?
Okay, I'm glad you asked. So here it is, 816 rings. Now I actually learned about this fairly recently. So what I have in my book, I'm one off. I have 815, and basically I went to a fossil expert. There's something called, I believe it's the Petrified Wood Museum online, and that was my source. And he said, I think it was 815. Well, maybe he just forgot. But anyway, you can actually go to Russell's Zool, SSLZUHL, and there's a contact. So he doesn't give a price. So I'm guessing those of you in here that are independently wealthy can contact this person, get a museum quality specimen there with 816 rings, a giant sequoia. And that's the dimensions, and that's a little kid for scale. So this thing is huge. Very good.
I would gather that those rings are probably pretty far apart. Those would that would be more sequoia-like than bristlecone-like. The rings would be far apart. For some trees that grow very little at any given time, the rings would be very, very close together.
Right.
And I was telling Jay about some tree samples I looked at where they were so close together that you needed a microscope to see them.
That's amazing. That really is. So again, yeah, if you have that wherewithal, go for it. RussellZool.com. I wasn't paid for that advertising. Now, I have a sample from the same place, so I'm going to pass this around. And in this sample, I have the McDermott caldera. It covers Oregon and Nevada. This particular specimen was from Oregon, but you can clearly see the rings. But I counted them. I don't think it's thousands. So, anyway, this is my sample from McDermott caldera. And Miocene, so roughly about 15 million years, allegedly. Same thing for that specimen. We got some winged elm, and we got some tan oak. And if you're ever up in Oregon and Nevada, I guess you could probably get some other samples. And again, like Mark said, often the mineralization process, it blurs out the rings. But as you see there, this one definitely, they're very clear and visible.
Can you say anything about the volcanic ash in that area?
No. What about it?
Okay, and I'm curious to know, because in the petrified forest, the volcanic ash is still there, and it tends to be a very soft material. It swells a lot when it gets wet, and it shrinks a lot when it dries. They're very soft and not bonded to itself, but the fossilized wood there is particularly hard, and whatever preservation process went on was quite aggressive. It kind of rearranged the internal appearance of the wood quite a lot.
Right.
And a lot of infusion of vivid colors and so forth.
Yes.
But it was a different kind of ash and a different burial circumstance for these because you had a lot of the fiber structure preserved in those. So the volcanic ash, to summarize, is not all alike, and all of these trees would have been preserved in something very chemically active, such as, well, fresh volcanic ash. But it's not the same everywhere, so you have, some pretty different degrees of preservation,
Right.
or qualities of preservation.
Exactly.
Do these correlate to modern species?
It's a honey locust.
I know, but like you said, the winged elm, is there a modern winged elm?
I'm not a tree person. Does anybody have a winged elm in their backyard or a tan oak?
Because this would also speak to stasis. I mean, if it's
Yeah,
15
there you
years
go.
old, then you
Exactly.
can see
About
these things.
kinds. That's another key
incredible.
point about my concept. Now, this is an ammonite, somewhat like a chambered nautilus, and obviously that's different than, say, a mussel. Not this kind of mussel, but like the mussels you eat. What we do is we put a little butter on it and Parmesan cheese.
You
Anybody?
actually found that in Texas? You found it?
Yeah, it's a part of it. It's not the whole thing. It's not my best specimen, but because I found it fairly recently and in the neighborhood.
The only ones I ever heard of were from Siberia.
This one's just somewhere in West Texas. But obviously it's the kind is unique. So when you look to the fossil record, how do you explain it? Let's say this was Triassic. Is there something going on during the Triassic time that only wants to bury ammonites? That doesn't quite fit. But if you think of all the major, the Cambrian and so forth, all the major different eras from the standard geology explanation as part of one great catastrophe, then you can explain the order through ecological zonation and differential mobility and hydrologic factors and maybe tectonic factors in this and the other. Then that shortens the chronology, which means, well, maybe the whole dating system was wrong, which pushes you to young Earth science. So it's kind of a step-by-step argument that biological stasis or fixity of the Genesis kinds leads you to a young Earth position. So it is kind of a step-by-step process. That's what I would argue. All right, now let's look at some of these old trees. The redwoods. Who's been up in Northern California to see the giant redwoods? Awesome, very good. So I guess I'm one of the few that have it. The bristlecone pines,
And the
of course, is
bristlecone
often considered
pines.
the oldest. Junipers and olive trees. And some of these can live up to 2,000, 3,000, or 4,000.
Underneath the
that-
bristlecone pines, there are trilobites.
Underneath?
Yes. In the shale that they're growing out of.
Wow, that's quite a connection there. So all the way back to the trilobites.
Sir, when I was, I believe it was around 1963.
That's Cambrian.
When I was on a tour in the area designated as the Garden of Gethsemane, I remember that our guide said that, and they were huge olive trees, mammoth trunks, and he said that the trees were there when Christ was on earth. So, I don't know, apparently that was true.
Did you happen to go
I
to
agree.
Lebanon?
No,
Okay.
this
They
was.
don't
They're
have
very
to.
hardy
Elise?
trees.
I was going to say, same with my daughter. When they went to Greece for their senior trip, they got pictures sitting in trees that the people there from Greece said that those trees have been there since Christ was walking here on earth. So pretty
There you
incredible.
go. We have some testimony.
Incredible.
These particular ones right here are considered the oldest by some, going back maybe another 2,000 years. Those particular trees right there. And again, you know, some of this may be controversy about, you know, exactly how we count all that.
But our
Right.
olive trees that we have
5,000.
here in Southern Cal, I mean, they don't live to that age.
No, but we've studied the fossil record and tons of fossils have been selected. So the fact that we overlooked it, it'd be pretty unlikely. That's essentially the argument. However, we're using the scriptural chronology. You basically have 1,600 years plus, and if the oldest one is 816 years old, well, we're fine, no problem. So that's the essence of the argument. Okay, now what is often done, it's dendrochronology. What we do is we take one set of tree rings from one tree and take it from another tree, take it from another tree, and we try to see how these match up. Like a short growth season, a longer one, and you know, the spring versus the winter, and if these line up, maybe there's a drought, different kind of environmental situations. And so now we can go back many years, and that has been attempted. And you know, maybe as much as 10,000 years that has been tried. Well, Brian Thomas, he did an article there, and if you do want to get this whole thing, the whole PowerPoint, just shoot me an email, I'll send it to you. And he basically brought out several points of complexities when we try to do this overlap in the dendrochronology. Sometimes there's missing rings, sometimes there's false rings, sometimes there's indistinct rings. You say, is that 2 rings or is it 4 rings? It's hard to tell. Sometimes there's multiple rings per year, and here's one I had never heard before. Sometimes rings can form in a matter of weeks. It's pretty amazing. And then droughts can sometimes lead to an extra ring. So there's all these assumptions and difficulties when you try to correlate them, and let's build a bigger chronology, and even a bigger chronology. It gets a little bit fuzzy. But when you're just dealing with one tree, there's still some questions, but it's not as quite as fuzzy on those sorts of things. All right. Now let's talk about groundwater. Y'all have been to see those redwoods. I mean, hey, it's worth a shot. How many of y'all have been to Thailand? Hey, we got a witness. Appreciate that. My wife's actually from the Philippines. It's the closest I've ever been to. All right. So they had some trees, and they knew this was what the date was. I think I think it was somewhere in the 50s. And then they had this dated by carbon-14, and then it was another 200 years older, based on that carbon-14 method. An explanation was there's some older water upwelling, some groundwater, that had contaminated the sample. Well, couldn't that same argument be used to criticize uranium-lead dating? Doesn't groundwaters flow through rocks that are used to date, you know, this hundreds of millions of years and so forth? And in my book, I do talk about that, where groundwater is a real clincher in terms of possibly leading to some of these erroneous dates of tens and hundreds of millions of years old. So groundwater can be a menace.
Another illustration that goes with that is when you use radiometric dating for lava in Hawaii that flows down and meets the ocean. The lava that didn't get wet comes out to a very different age from the lava that cooled in the water.
Very good.
Yeah, like the flood.
Excellent. So that's a pretty important thing to catch. Okay, now we have a hint about the idea of the time period of the whole geologic column, because we don't find any of these trees that have thousands of rings. What about the date of the flood itself? Are there any hints? And some of you may be aware of this. Often, there's one of those bristlecone pines called Methuselah, which, roughly is awfully close to 4,000 plus years old, something around that. Well, there was a scholar, Edmund Schulman. He studied at universities in California as well as Arizona. He passed in 1958. This is something he wrote just 4 years earlier in 54. Sequoia giganti trees may enjoy perpetual life in absence of gross destruction, since they appear immune to pest attack. They can pretty much take anything. Does that mean that shortly preceding 3275 years ago, or 4,000 years ago, if John Muir's figure is correct, all the then living giant sequoias were wiped out by some catastrophe? Well, let's go with that. Maybe it was a giant catastrophe. And is that the only place on Earth that we find old living trees? I showed you an example in Lebanon. No. So there's various places here and there where trees are pretty close to that 4,000 mark. So that must mean we're talking about a global catastrophe. And he was at least willing to see that implication. Because otherwise, how come we don't have a 6,000-year-old tree or an 8,000-year-old tree? Now, I know different things have been claimed to go with that, but that's kind of another issue. But the straightforward understanding of it would be that somewhere around, if you do the calculation, it's around 2046 BC, and the more traditional date of the flood is around 2350 BC. Pretty much fits, and I think that's pretty amazing.
So is he basing this statement on the fact that the largest, oldest tree is approximately 3275 years old?
Right, is that they should be living longer unless there were just some ultra massive catastrophe that just, wiped everything off the earth. In Antarctica, this is an example of a tree from the Antarctic, and that doesn't even appear to be mineralized. I'm not sure what these inclusions are, but just as an illustration. But in my book, I reference some trees in Antarctica from different evolutionary ages, and about 100 million year difference there. No, I don't think it's quite that much. It might be more like 10 million years, if I recall correctly. But basically, the upper Permian versus the middle Triassic, and they both show a temperate climate. Warmer in the spring and then colder in the winter, that sort of thing. But what if we could use those same techniques about dendrochronology, and they actually matched up year for year? And again, the evolutionists wouldn't even want to try that sort of thing, but say a suggestion for further research. Well, that would mean, well, I guess they're not separated by 10 million years because they happened at the same time, if all of those rings were a perfect match. And that sort of thing was done. Those of you that are familiar with John Morse's book, The Young Earth, the researcher's name was Art, A-R-C-T, which is kind of interesting. But he did that with the Yellowstone fossil forests, as they're called, and showed that the different layers actually did fit with the same time scale. So I'm saying that kind of approach could be extrapolated to some other examples there. And again, that sample, doesn't even look like it's mineralized, which is another thing. Well, is it really that old? Because that particular sample, I'm not sure the age. However,
I speculate that it probably is because those inclusions are acting lens-like. The way they're capturing the light, they appear to be a clear agate.
Okay.
Yes, they are.
So the way the light's playing makes me think that that's a piece of rock there.
Okay, gotcha. And then in Alberta, there's a tree that's supposedly 100 million years old, and it's not petrified, and you can see like the cell walls very clearly, like all the detail is there. Well, in 100 million years, wouldn't some of these things break down? So there's a number of examples like that, sort of like the soft tissue in the dinosaurs, how could this possibly be preserved for that long? So fossil trees,
Where was that one?
that's in Alberta. I referenced that in my book. But supposedly it's 100 million years old. That's the part that doesn't quite seem to click.
They claim frozen conditions allow it to.
That might be their explanation exactly. But still, you know, things tend to break down over time, and maybe even bacteria could possibly break it down.
Oh yeah, dogs can eat them.
Yeah, isn't that something?
Can
Yeah, I
you
don't think I
imagine
would.
trying to eat that meat?
Yeah, I don't think I want to. So basically, my book argues
Some people
from
do.
several bases. I try to argue from geology and philosophy and from history and biology. Try to argue from those bases. And in terms of history, it's a book I haven't read yet, but in terms I've heard great recommendations of, because I have a great respect for John Warwick Montgomery.
Oh
And-
yes.
And he wrote a book,
Absolutely.
Where is History Going? Where is history going? And what's very interesting about it, you see these connections in time. Well, that was way back there. There couldn't have been a connection. C.S. Lewis wrote a recommend for that book. And I thought, well, that's interesting. C.S. Lewis to John Warwick Montgomery, and he's still with us. It's kind of amazing. Anyway, but I try to use arguments from all those connections. And of course, with biology, we should always think of a John Sanford and genetic entropy. All of his arguments are quite powerful. But at the beginning of my book, I do talk about presuppositions and worldview and how you're biased and so forth, and the sociology of science. I deal with those issues. So I do try to take a both-hand approach. All right. Okay. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Elaine Kennedy. She's done some work with, the supposed fossilized dinosaur eggs and whether they're nests or not, and those sorts of issues. She actually brought this to my attention. I actually have this textbook at home. It's Stokes and Judson. It's a standard geology text. You know, it didn't come from ICR or someplace like that. Introduction to Geology. That's the page right there. There's our good friend Cuvier. Cuvier, everybody? All right, but anyway, he's known for being a catastrophist. But where I have it marked on the right there, it says this. A catastrophist might contend that the twisting and breaking of strata, the transportation of huge blocks of rock, the violent cutting of canyons, and the wholesale destruction of life is within the power of a universal flood, he would be right. So they admit it can make sense. If that's your assumption, then you go with it, it can make sense. But then they say, but we'd rather go with, slow and steady wins the race, da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah, but look at Mount St. Helens.
Exactly. And it was in 1968, so they didn't have a time machine, unfortunately. But you're right, Mount St. Helens really puts this to rest. It puts the burden on those that are against the catastrophist viewpoint. So there's various versions of catastrophism, but once you're kind of consistent with it, I think it really does show that all these separate catastrophes were part of one great catastrophe, the global flood, because like I showed the picture, a little cartoon of the Grand Canyon, you don't see the evidence of erosional features between those layers. So just like making pancakes, all of those layers must have formed within a short time of each other. And that's a key thought that I really drill in on several pages in my book where I talk about paraconformities. All right, so the geologists, they're with us. That's good news. How about the philosophers? And this specifically relates to the dating methods, which, if you go before we had radioactive dating, we had to estimate. Well, let's look at this particular formation, how long did it take to form, that sort of thing. So the age estimates were all over the map. This is Alexander Bird, a philosophy professor from the University of Bristol. Hypotheses are not tested and falsified by having theory-free perceptions of the world, that is, without presuppositions. Evidence of the age of rocks depends on the employment of hypotheses concerning radioactive decay. So the successful refutation of the young Earth hypothesis depends on the truth of a theory in physics. But according to Karl Popper's own epistemology, that is how we know things, if one cannot depend on the truth of the auxiliary hypotheses, the theory of radioactive decay, one cannot trust the resulting datum, the age of the rocks, used to refute the hypothesis that the Earth is young. So, to put it in simpler terms, he's basically saying maybe there is a possibility that the young Earth view is right, because we don't have an airtight way to refute it. So at least he's being honest. And again, where he's coming from, I'm not fully sure what his full position is, but at least he's willing to see the other side in a sense. And one interesting thing about his research, if you go to his page and read, he has a real interest in natural kinds, which connects with the Genesis kinds. And I have a whole chapter, I call it the stasis of essential types of life. Just another way to relate it, because biological essentialism in academic circles, it's a well-researched and well-accepted topic, but it means the same thing. It means exactly the same thing. All right. I also mentioned history. That's also part of my argument. You may be familiar with this Babylonian map of the world. If we do the Latin along and measure it, or if we try to match it up to Google Maps, it won't work. So it's kind of like a topical map, or as a mathematician you might say a topological map. It kind of gives us the general idea of how everything relates to each other. That's really what it is. All right. Remember the Epic of Gilgamesh. It tells the story of this hero who goes out to find the survivor of the flood. And I think he maybe searches for, the secret of eternal life or something. That's the general idea. So Gilgamesh is the hero. He's not the one that survived the flood. He's trying to find the one who survived the flood. And that's Utnapishtim is that guy's name. It's there at the bottom. Kind of a funny name. I think I like Noah better, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, anyway. So historical evidence for Gilgamesh's existence is found in inscriptions crediting him with the building of the Great Walls of Uruk, that is modern-day Warqa, Iraq. So we could go to those walls, I guess, supposedly. I don't know if with money volunteers would be that dangerous. But if that's historical, those walls are real. Gilgamesh might be historical. And then he's referenced by known historical figures of his time around the 26th century BC, such as King Enmubaragesi of Kish, and more recently by the claim of a team of German archaeologists to have discovered the tomb of Gilgamesh in April of 2003. Now this Babylonian map of the world mentions Utnapishtim, and as well as Sargon of Akkad. You can look up the history of these places. I think some of the seminaries, they do teach Akkadian as well, just so you know the background languages. So if Sargon of Akkad is a real historical person, why not Utnapishtim? And if Gilgamesh is a real person, and the whole story about him is he's looking for the survivor of the flood, maybe that's real too. Yes. So another argument that based on history there. All right, who is the guy in the bottom right corner? Who's this in the bottom right corner? John Sanford. Awesome. Okay. And so I think it would be great for his story to be turned into a movie, something like A Beautiful Mind, because what we need is more things out there in the public that kind of gets people thinking, creation, it's okay. And I'm thinking that maybe even a title just like The Creationist, I think would be a good example. There's several others, but his story's pretty neat. And the fact that he invented the gene gun, I mean, that changes our lives. So, a genius, and yet willing to consider that God's truth might actually help our science, might improve it. All right, now this fits in with his viewpoint about the genetic entropy. Michael Nachman and Susan Crowell, writing in the journal Genetics, said, "We estimate that the genomic deleterious mutation rate, U, is at least 3. This rate is difficult to reconcile with the multiplicative fitness effects of individual mutations. The high deleterious mutation rate in humans represents a paradox. If mutations interact multiplicatively, the genetic load associated with such a high U would be intolerable in species with a low rate of reproduction." And they go on. "Given this scenario, each female would need to produce 40 offspring for 2 to survive." Now we're not counting grandkids, great. We're not counting that. We're talking as an individual. Any volunteers? 40 kids? Any volunteers? I didn't see any hands. Okay. So and then it goes on and says, well, even then we're being hopeful. And we think it's really even worse than that. So just like John Sanford, guess what? We're going extinct. Make sure you get your bucket list done. Write all your little green cards to your kids. Make sure you have all that done. Do all that stuff. Because apparently we're totally hopeless. Exactly what John Sanford said. So he was right. Good way to go, creation science. He had it down. and that perfectly agrees with that. All right. Now, I want to tell a little story. Yes.
Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
When he says the mutation rate is at least 3, 3 of what? 3 mutations per year? 3
Now,
mutations
I have to
per-
go back to the article because some of this was a little bit beyond me.
Okay.
I'm not sure. And just the fact that if one thing is wrong, let's say my immunity goes down, well, then I'm going to get more sicknesses. But because I had a mutation with something else, with the combination, 2 bad things happening to you can really, almost knock you out. So that part I understand, but in terms of exactly what the 3 was, I'd have to go back and try to decipher the article. But I do reference it in my book.
All right.
That is the original article.
Good.
So I'll admit ignorance on that. I do have a story here, a quick story. Now that story, right? Wink, wink. Y'all, it's a story. Okay, make sure you're with me here. Some interaction. So pay close attention, listen carefully, put on your Sherlock. Here it is. John Sanford, I bet y'all didn't know that I know him very well. And just last year, we went to Iraq. And guess what? An RPG knocked out our helicopter. Yeah. Now, I told you it was a story. Now, listen carefully. Listen carefully. And that wasn't enough excitement, so we decided to go to Nolans. Then we decided to go to New Orleans, right? And guess what we saw in the street?
No.
Dead bodies. We saw dead bodies in the street, and guess where we saw those dead bodies? The French Quarter. Yes, exactly. Okay, one element of this story is true. Just trying to help you to put on your baloney detector, apply your critical thinking. One element in that story was true, and only one.
You knew John Sanford.
You've been to New
No.
Orleans.
There it is.
Okay, what's your name, sir?
Lindo?
Lindell, everybody. Bingo. Good brain. Good brain. I gave you a good brain. I went to the math convention last year. I guess your tax dollars at work one way or the other. And it was the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And of course, core this, core that, everywhere core. That's kind of where the emphasis was, and a lot of environmentalism and this and that. But that's it. Outside of that, all the rest was just made up. But I was actually in New Orleans last year. That was it. Okay, did not see any dead bodies. All right. Okay, one more thing here. Okay, YoungEarthScienceBook.com. Boy, that's a mouthful. Long-winded. So I wanted to give you a shorter version. So for Total Truth, support Earth's youth, and TotalYouth.us, not .com or anything. It's just a shortcut. Takes you to the same place. So that works for you. What's in the center of that? Let me help you out. What's in the center of that?
Crop circles?
What does that T look like? Thank you. So all of this is the point is so we can point others towards Christ, and that's the ultimate thing about it. There's so many different evidences we could point at. I have something. I think this might be shale, but if I twist this around, can you see the pearly luster? Okay. So I got that from Oklahoma, and where I'm from, and I'm not a chemist. How long does pearly luster last? I don't know. But I know this is older. Might even be supposedly 100 million. Does it last that long? So that's more of an intuitive thing, and there's lots of things like that. But we're so brainwashed, you say, oh, it's 100 million years. Okay, I believe you. And that sort of thing. And even Michio Kaku, he's on a BBC documentary where they do talk about the age of the Earth. And what does he do? Well, let's call up my geology friend. Well, your geology, you know all about. Well, just take everything he says. He knows all about it. So when I pick up this, I have no idea how old it is. There's nothing we can directly measure that. But again, there are some ammonites that actually do have a pearly luster similar to that. I've seen some specimens. Yeah.
And I should mention that
Indeed.
if you have dug up a lot of shell fossils, you will find quite a few of them, but probably most anywhere, where the print of the shell is there, and the texture of the shell and everything else is completely dissolved away. Okay, quite a few shells are deposited in material that is porous, which is to say it gets wet each time it rains. And so you have a process going to this day to dissolve the shells away. And then that leaves you with a particular detail that if the shells can dissolve away, then you have, we might call it a stroke of luck. If you come to any shell at all, and there are quite a few of those, the pearlescence is gone because that's largely on the surface of the shell. And but you do come across some fossils where the pearlescent material is remaining, And mathematically speaking, you have to say that if you see that at all, you're beating the odds. It's not an extremely typical fossil result, even if it's, you know, you can see a lot of them.
Mhm.
It's common, but it's not by any means universal. The more typical picture is that the shell is completely dissolved away.
Very good, very good. On the left is a living chambered nautilus, and there's just 6 living species. Well, let's say we didn't know about those, because you have to go like, I mean, to get a bigger amount of them, those that fish for them, you have to go 300 meters plus. So the fact that we maybe hadn't discovered them, did that mean they didn't exist? So you can use that same argument about, you know, did man live with dinosaurs? Just
This is the
because
modern
we
one.
haven't seen those fossils yet together in
Chambered
those
nautilus.
aspects, does that necessarily mean that man didn't exist? In other words, whatever fossil you pick, they tend to get more and more into recent times and more into older times as we dig up more fossils. That is, the range gets bigger in both directions. Well, what is the concept of the flood? Is all these organisms lived at the same time, and it's just through various methods that it created an order to it.
Sorting,
Okay, let me end with a scripture and then one more thing. So part of what I'm saying is that evidence is out there, it's just that it's a spiritual conflict, and that's why people don't want to go along with it. Out of Jeremiah. This shall be a sign to you, declares the Lord, that I will punish you in this place in order that you may know that my words will surely stand against you for harm. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will give Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, into the hand of his enemies and into the hand of those who seek his life. Now, I wasn't able to get a photograph of Pharaoh Hophra, so I just pulled something that looked Egyptian, so just to make that point. But there's something that those people living during Jeremiah's time, they could have seen what actually happened with their eyes, possibly. They saw that actual evidence, and because Jeremiah predicted that, that gave them the confidence that God's word is true and that Jeremiah himself was his true prophet. So there's an evidential aspect when we look at the prophecies, and especially those who lived during Jesus' time or lived during Jeremiah's time. So there's, in the terms of the aspect of one way of apologetics or another, I think that there's a lot of scripture that goes with that. And I really appreciate your participation, and thank you for listening. And this is one example of something that I think we really need to pray about, is younger people especially, to get into the social media and things like YouTube. I really like this one. It's on the other side, but I really like it. I thought it was well done. How to Date a Planet, that's the actual title on YouTube. 1.2 million views. Notice the 728 thumbs down. I'm guessing the creationist or two might have been in that number.
Yeah.
And subscribers, almost to 1 million. That's pretty good. Guess what? He's taking a trip to Honolulu pretty soon. Once you're up in that range, you're doing all right. And Men of Earth, they have several that are geology related. But if you do know some animators, I appreciate you. If you throw them, or if you do it yourself, I appreciate you throwing them my way. Do we usually? Oh, one other thing. Who subscribes to the quarterly, the Creation Research Quarterly? All right. Well, I believe this is the most recent issue, the December 14th. And here's a mastodon, and this is actually in my neck of the woods. Haven't been there yet, but it's on my bucket list. But the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum, it's in West Texas. It's Joe Taylor, not Paul Taylor.
Right.
But there it is. It's actually from Hawaii, but it's actually located there now. And when they looked at all the bacteria from the gut, there was a whole bunch of them. And again, bacteria can live for a while, but eventually they're going to run out of food or something. So again, another indicator. Maybe that mastodon wasn't as old as the evolutionists say it is. So I thought that was an interesting example.
4,000.
Yeah, so do we usually open for questions?
And by all means, yes.
Okay. Any questions?
I just a comment.
Yeah, or comments, either one.
And a question. I remember being at the Science Museum in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there was something, an element of an exhibit that it seemed like it was described something like an amberized insect, and part of the description was that it was 54 million years ago. And I just remember these kids on a field trip were walking by and kind of oohing and awing about if it was 54 million years. I think that's something like that. And it seemed like their teacher said, well, no, I was just passing by and I think he said, Well, nobody knows for sure because nobody was there.
Hey,
Oh,
there
that's
we go. Very good.
Truth.
And I wonder if there was DNA in that insect.
Yes,
I think we
absolutely.
Jurassic Park notwithstanding.
Exactly.
A lot of the insects are just films on the inside. It's not, there's not really something in them.
Oh,
Wrong.
good point.
Sir, I wanted
That's
to
wrong.
ask you too, I think, I'm not absolutely certain, but I think there's a creation museum.
They're
that's
preserved.
In Tennessee. I think it's true. Have you been there and would you recommend visiting it?
Yeah.
Oh, I have not been there, but I
Yes.
totally recommend it. Yes.
Oh, yeah,
Recommend it. You can't
everything
aim
I know
twice.
says visit there,
Mhm.
that does creation.
Yeah, I definitely recommend it.
Mhm. Me too.
More questions, comments?
You wanna find the
Oh, okay. You think, oh, I know who will help us, the National Science Foundation. Well, I got the evidence right here in my book. Listen closely.
No.
This is David B. Campbell, Program Director with the NSF. In response to your inquiry for research funding for younger science, the Geoscience Directorate at the NSF supports a variety of research in Earth and atmospheric science. NSF would support research that investigates the age of the Earth in the form of a research proposal that describes hypotheses and rigorous methods to test those hypotheses. All proposals are peer-reviewed by scientific experts from across the U.S. using National Science Board merit review criteria regarding intellectual merit and broader impacts. So there it is in black and white. You can send a research proposal. I don't know how far
Darwinism.
it'll get, but yes.
Darwinism.
First round.
Depends who the peers are.
Yes.
As long as it doesn't conflict with Darwinism or
Thank you for coming.
uniformitarianism.
I brought a rose.